Hello, and thanks for taking the time to listen to Reimagining Cyber. New episodes of the podcast drop every Wednesday. So to make sure you never miss a show, do hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also find us on the @Reimagining Cyber YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber, and this week we're covering a set of stories that on the surface look very different. We've got the ShinyHunters extortion of Pornhub user activity data, widespread MongoDB database exposure, which is being called the MongoDB bleed, phishing kits getting more advanced, and ransomware continuing to hammer critical sectors. Now with me is Tyler Moffitt, our resident cybersecurity expert. Tyler, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Now, Tyler, when you look at all of these together, what stands out to you?
Yeah, definitely going to be just like low effort, low sophistication, like what's actually required to cause basically major damage right now. None of these stories depend on 0 days, nation state, hoarding of 0 days or tooling or groundbreaking exploits, none of that. So all of them are essentially relying on misconfiguration, exposed data, weak identity controls, and business pressure. And so attackers are just the path of least resistance, right? And still creating maximum impact. And that path is still very available, and so they're going to keep pushing it.
Let's start then with the ShinyHunters story. They're claiming theft of activity data tied to over 200 million Pornhub premium users. What actually happened there?
Yeah, so this was classic ShinyHunters. This is what they do. According to reporting, the group claims that they got 94 gigabytes of user activity tied to the premium accounts. That includes anything from like viewing history, search behavior, timestamps, all the metadata. What's important though is what this incident is not. It is not a ransomware attack. It is not encryption of any of the data. It doesn't even really look to be a direct breach of like Pornhub's core systems. The data is believed to come to like a third-party analytics provider.
So no passwords, no payment data, but still a major issue.
Yeah, basically, the behavioral data is still incredibly sensitive and I would say valuable to sell, especially in this context, because even without financial details, this kind of information is reputational risk, personal privacy risk, and it's greater attempt for personal targeted extortion on users, and that carries value. People want to buy that stuff. So ShinyHunters understands that the embarrassment and reputational pressure can be just as powerful as like locking down the systems. This is what they're known for, right? They don't encrypt anything, which is why they focus on data theft and public exposure rather than traditional ransomware, because that's a tried and true method, but it takes time encrypting the files, charging money for the key. They don't want to deal with any of that. We have the data. The data itself is embarrassing enough. That's enough pressure for you to want to pay us.
It feels like a reminder, if you like, that not all breaches look like breaches.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Many organizations, they still equate breaches to like malware alerts and system outages, but really breaches a lot of the times are quiet, right? Data can be accessed through third-party platforms, analytics tools, and misconfigured services, is the first sign of trouble. There's so many different ways, and none of this raises up any red flags. And a lot of the times, the first sign of any issue is just the extortion demand. You're like, what? I had no idea. So it reinforces how much trust organizations place in third-party providers, a lot of the times without full visibility into how that data is handled.
So is this a trend you expect to continue?
Yeah, there's no reason why not. This is tried and true, bread and butter, shiny extortion speciality. Third-party access is easily one of the most efficient attacks available, one that can compromise and impact dozens or hundreds of downstream organizations from an attacker's perspective. It's really high leverage with, like we talked about, the theme of this podcast, low effort.
Let's shift then to MongoDB bleed. The name makes it sound like a vulnerability, but that isn't really what's happening. Explain if you would.
Yeah, so the name might be misleading. It's coined from, I believe, Heartbleed, which was a vulnerability, exploit that was done like years and years ago, and so that's why it's called that. But MongoDB bleed is not really a vulnerability in MongoDB itself. What researchers saw is that thousands of MongoDB databases were exposed directly to the internet with authentication disabled. So the data is reachable, it's readable, no exploit, no malware, no user interaction. Attackers literally can just query up and be like, all right, give me your database, let me see it, let me browse it, let me copy data, and it's fully accessible, fully ready to go, like you already own it, because there was no authentication ever implemented. I mean, this sounds kind of ridiculous in 2026, but here we are. And so that they get to just literally copy data, insert ransom notes, delete databases entirely. It's pretty crazy.
Why does this keep happening then? We've been talking about exposed databases for years, haven't we?
Well, I think it's honestly just ease of the MongoDB infrastructure. This is not the first or the last time people will be talking about MongoDB, but databases, they can get spun up very quickly for development and testing in MongoDB, like short-term projects, testing things out, whatever. And cloud networking makes it very easy to expose those services unintentionally, right? So asset inventories really don't always keep up with reality. Over time, you end up with orphan systems that nobody is actively managing, but are still accessible to the internet.
And attackers are just scanning for this.
Yeah, basically, honestly, like that's what they've just been doing. And you can automate it too. You just point your tools to scan for it, and because they're not targeting any specific companies, they're just scanning IP ranges, right, and cloud providers, common ports, and what comes up, right, and anything that responds that doesn't require any authentication, right, it gets cataloged, and it's like we can access that later anytime we want. It's pretty crazy, and from there, attackers decide if it's worth even looking into extorting, selling, or just erasing whatever they want.
Yeah, what's the real takeaway, would you say, for defenders here?
Yeah, so misconfiguration, right, is one of the most reliable attack paths. That's what you've got to stop. So if your security strategy assumes that attackers need exploits, you're definitely missing where a lot of real-world breaches actually come from, this being a perfect example. So, this is really about fundamentals, right? Asset visibility, access controls, network exposure, like regular audits, right? None of this requires new tools. It just requires discipline.
Okay, at the top of the show, I said we're going to talk about ShinyHunters. I said we talk about MongoDB. I also said phishing kits. So we're seeing phishing kits getting more advanced. What's changed there?
Yeah, so we're seeing them evolve further. I know, can you believe it? AI helping out, but basically just reducing their friction and increasing success rates. So now the times we're seeing like real-time credential validation, MFA bypass, IP filtering, geofencing. I mean, attackers want to know immediately whether these stolen credentials work. So they don't just want to collect junk data, right? They also want to avoid, researchers and scanners, which is why these, kits actively filter traffic.
So MFA isn't enough anymore?
I mean, it's critical. And for the most part, yes, it does help. But essentially what we're seeing is attackers are adapting. They're now targeting session tokens. I think we've mentioned this before, that those OAuth tokens, those cookies and session tokens, they persist through any like password reset and things like that. And so they can abuse push fatigue, and they get to exploit identity workflows rather than passwords alone. So identity is now, for sure, one of the most valuable attack surfaces once you have a valid credentials. And so a lot of defenses simply just, they're belly up after you have that.
Finally then, let's go on to ransomware. It's continuing to hit critical sectors, but what is different now compared to a few years ago?
I would say intent. Attackers are deliberately choosing environments where the downtime equals leverage. So, of course, manufacturing, healthcare, energy, transportation, critical services, public sector, right? These environments, like just a few hours or a day of disruption, like is massive consequences, right? Attackers understand that and have their campaigns literally built around it. So encryption is no longer a weapon. In many cases, the data theft alone is enough to force negotiation. That's what we call double extortion, essentially. Not only are we extorting you for the key to get your stuff back, but we're extorting you from the embarrassment of, exposure of, personal identifiable information of whoever the customers are. And if you're a public entity, or critical sector and service, like, this is huge. It only compounds from there.
So ransomware's more about pressure than malware now.
Yeah, and I think it's been moving that way for the past few years, to be honest. I mean, the double extortion really is like, you'd be hard pressed to find a ransomware group out there that doesn't do the double extortion or just the data theft extortion. As far as encryption only, meaning pay us back for your encryption key, rarely do we see that. Almost always there's that secondary threat of, we're going to leak it if you don't pay. So, they have that extra push. And that's the whole point beyond it. You got to think about, you want to put organizations in a position where every option sucks, if that makes sense, and no one wants to deal with crisis comms and delivering all the statements, of data exposure, right? It's really tough. And not to mention these specific sectors we're talking about and the targets, the downtime is way more expensive than, some other business.
So if organizations don't want to get into an every option sucks situation, what should they be focusing on?
Resilience, eating your cybersecurity vegetables, like the foundation, the basics. You want to always be under the assumption that you're going to get hacked, right? Something will get through eventually. Focus on detection, containment, the network segmentation, recovery, like decision-making under pressure. Do tabletop exercises, right? Make sure that you've sort of done a dry run of this if it ever were to happen, so you know what to do and how to move as quickly and as smoothly as possible, not running around with your head cut off. A lot of the times ransomware incidents, they fail in the response phase, not the technical phase. So if leadership isn't aligned and plans aren't rehearsed, the attackers have all the leverage in the world.
Great stuff, Tyler. Now, if you had to summarize all of these 4 stories into one sentence, what would it be?
Attackers are picking the path of least resistance, or the easiest path, right? It's not the most advanced or technical one.
Good stuff. And final advice for defenders listening out there?
Yeah, don't over-index all the fancy, shiny tools. Focus on the fundamentals, right? Eating your cybersecurity vegetables. Know what you have, control who can access it, reduce exposure, plan on recovery, do tabletop exercises. Most of the incidents we discussed today are like preventable without new technology. Patch.
Tyler, fantastic. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Ben.
And thanks to you for listening to Reimagining Cyber. We will be back next Wednesday when Rob Arago is going to be speaking to Teresa Lanowitz. She's a globally recognized cybersecurity leader, and she's going to be digging into cyber resilience and what it really means in 2026. Why it's got to be owned by the entire organization and not just security teams. That's going to be dropping, like I said, next Wednesday. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.